Another reminder for our network stations and our listeners around the country that the CBS radio network will program continuously on the story of the death of President John Kennedy and subsequent developments until further note. And now we're going to pause again briefly to allow our stations to identify themselves. We will pause 5 seconds for station identification. This is the CBS radio network.
From studios in Minneapolis and St. Paul at 830 WCCO. CCO temperature 34 degrees.
Back at the CBS News headquarters in New York with more reaction to the tragedy which occurred today in Dallas, Texas, the assassination of President Kennedy. Radio stations throughout Western and Eastern Europe are broadcasting only funeral music after announcing the Kennedy death. Television stations are keeping up a steady flow of bulletins and have canceled regular shows. Church bells are tolling in many capitals. In Berlin, the news particularly shocked West Berliners who had warmly embraced President Kennedy when he visited there last summer. First news of the murder came in the middle of a Berlin evening newscast. In one Berlin restaurant, a woman began screaming when the broadcast was heard. People sat motionless with completely stunned expressions on their faces. Yugoslavia's top commentator gave the news with a tremor in his throat a few minutes after the end of a regular newscast. Dutch Premier Victor Marajan said if this deed was committed by a political fanatic and not by a madman, then I would be highly indignant. He went on to say that the murder was a disaster for international politics. Belgium's Foreign Minister Paul-Henri Spaak sobbed as he talked over the telephone to say, "What can I say about this hideous news, except that I am stunned and that a terrible, frightening thing has happened. I cannot speak tonight." The reaction of Paul-Henri Spaak in Brussels. Italian President Segni said, "It is a grave loss to all mankind." From Dallas, we have had a few more details on the death of President Kennedy. The attending surgeon says the president was shot through the throat and head, possibly by the same bullet. Dr. Malcolm Perry said there was an entrance wound below his Adam's apple. There was another wound in the back of his head. 2 of the 10 physicians in attendance on the president said it was possible that one bullet entered the throat and went through the back of the president's head. Vice President Lyndon Johnson has now been sworn in as president, and to hear the story of the swearing-in ceremony, we're going to switch to CBS News correspondent Robert Pierpoint at Love Field in Dallas.
Here at Love Field, just outside Dallas, Texas, a new president of the United States has been sworn in, Lyndon Baines Johnson, and he is now on his way to Washington by jet aircraft. Aboard the same plane is the casket bearing John Fitzgerald Kennedy. Mrs. Kennedy is also aboard the same jet aircraft, accompanying her husband's body back to Washington. The official swearing-in ceremony took place aboard Air Force One, that is the president's plane, here at Love Field at 2:39 this afternoon, Central Standard Time. The ceremony took approximately 5 minutes. It was held in the crowded presidential suite aboard the president's jet. Mrs. Johnson stood on the president's right. Mrs. Kennedy, the bereaved widow, stood on the president's left as the ceremony was held. The oath was administered by a federal district judge from northern Texas, a woman, 67-year-old Sarah Hughes, who was appointed a federal judge by the late President Kennedy in 1961. As the judge administered the oath of office to the new president, she was crying, and Mrs. Kennedy, of course, had tears in her eyes. A number of those in the crowded forward cabin of the jet plane also were red-eyed with weeping over the death of President Kennedy. The ceremony concluded. President Johnson turned, embraced Mrs. Kennedy, and then said, "Let's get this plane off to Washington." I repeat, a new president of the United States has been sworn in here at Love Field outside Dallas. He is now on his way to Washington. This is Robert Pierpoint reporting.
Back at our news headquarters in New York, my colleague Dallas Townsend has some background information and further sidelights on the life and the history and career of the new president of the United States. Dallas?
Alan, on the day that Lyndon Baines Johnson was born, his grandfather is said to have looked at him and said, "He'll be a United States Senator someday." That prophecy was borne out. 29 years after it was made, the grandson was elected to Congress. In 1948, when he was 40 years old, he was elected to the Senate. He won his first seat in the Senate by the almost invisible margin of 87 votes. But that fact didn't dampen his sense of humor. He began a speech a short time later by saying, "Well, here I am, landslide Lyndon." Within 4 years after that, his Democratic colleagues chose him as the Senate Majority Leader, an honor which he retained throughout the rest of his career in the United States Senate. In 1960, Lyndon Johnson was elected Vice President of the United States, an office which carried with it the duty of presiding over the Senate, in which he had served for 12 years. At the same time, he was a candidate for re-election to his Senate seat, and he also won that, but naturally he couldn't hold both offices, and he resigned from the Senate. At the Democratic Convention in Los Angeles in 1960, Mr. Johnson was a serious contender for the presidential nomination. He was strongly supported by Southern delegates, but he lost out to the junior senator from Massachusetts, John F. Kennedy. Mr. Kennedy received 806 votes on the first ballot. Lyndon Johnson received 409. The number required for a nomination was 761. Some of us who were on the outskirts of Los Angeles that night remember standing outside the small apartment house where Senator Kennedy was incommunicado, waiting for the result of the vote. The apartment house was owned, as I recall, by Bill Gargan, the retired movie actor who has always been a good friend of President Kennedy. And when he came out, there was an enormous crush, a tremendous crush on the street of that rather quiet suburb of Los Angeles. Then Mr. Kennedy drove into Los Angeles to accept the nomination in person. Mr. Kennedy then chose Senator Johnson for second place on the ticket. He said that Lyndon Johnson has demonstrated on many occasions his brilliant qualifications for the leadership we require today. The ticket was intended to reinforce a noticeably weak spot on Kennedy's southern flank, notably Texas, and to provide a balance. Kennedy was a liberal Yankee. He came from Massachusetts, while Johnson was a Southerner, somewhat more conservative, and came from Texas. But he has proved since then that he is not conservative in the sense that the word is usually known. He has been just as liberal in his thinking as the president. In any case, it proved to be a winning combination. Johnson's Texas, which had gone for General Eisenhower in 1952 and 1956, returned to the Democratic fold, but only narrowly by 43,000 votes. And it's doubly ironic that one of the reasons for Mr. Kennedy's trip to Texas, the fatal trip, was to shore up the Democratic Party strength in Texas and reinforce his chances for winning the state next year. Mr. Kennedy captured all but 3 states of the traditionally Protestant South, where his Catholic faith had been a live issue in the campaign.
Dallas, we have received still more reaction here, and one of the latest is from Paris, from French President de Gaulle, who didn't always see eye to eye with Mr. Kennedy on international matters, and particularly in regard to the common market and NATO. But President de Gaulle said President Kennedy died like a soldier under fire for his duty and in the service of his country. In the name of the French people, ever the friend of the American people, I salute this great example and this great memory. Here in New York, Governor Nelson Rockefeller said the death of President Kennedy is a terrible tragedy for the nation and the world. He said, Mrs. Rockefeller and I join with all New Yorkers and every American in extending heartfelt sympathy to Mrs. Kennedy and the President's family. And he added, may God grant strength and guidance to Lyndon Johnson as he assumes his grave responsibilities under the tragic circumstances. The prayers of all of us will be with him. The late president's youngest brother, Senator Edward Kennedy, and his sister Eunice Shriver flew red-eyed and somber to Hyannisport to be with their parents. Senator Ted Kennedy and his sister arrived at Andrews Air Force Base by helicopter and within minutes had boarded a jet for Cape Cod to be with ailing former Ambassador Joseph Kennedy and Mrs. Rose Kennedy. It was young Senator Kennedy who was presiding over the Senate when he was informed that his brother had been shot in Dallas. Adlai Stevenson, the head of our mission to the United Nations, personally told his staff of the president's assassination. Stevenson, who was attacked by pickets in Dallas only last month, called his staff heads to his office at the U.S. mission headquarters at the UN to give them the news, and he is reported to have been deeply moved. President Kennedy's younger sister, Rose, learned of her brother's assassination while watching a television broadcast from Dallas, where the president was shot.
Alan, another ironic note in a day that certainly seems to be full of ironies. Lincoln's vice president was named Andrew Johnson.
That is...
When Lincoln died in April 1865, Andrew Johnson became the 17th president of the United States.
That is irony with a note of history to it indeed, reaching all the way back over the decades.
Alan, we're going to switch again now across the Atlantic to Western Europe for reaction to the assassination of President Kennedy, and this time we're going to hear from Bonn and CBS News correspondent Daniel Shore.
Yes, Dallas. Chancellor Ludwig Erhard heard the news of President Kennedy's death on the train as he was returning from his visit to President de Gaulle in Paris and was preparing to fly to Washington on Sunday to see President Kennedy. Erhard's immediate reaction, even before his train had reached Bonn, which it'll do in about 45 minutes, was to postpone the Washington visit, which was to inaugurate a new and friendlier era in relations between the government chiefs. But even former Chancellor Adenauer, who was often privately critical of the president, was described as shocked by the news, and he has expressed his grief in a telegram to the White House. In the absence of Chancellor Erhard, the first official reaction from the government came from Vice Chancellor Erich Mende, who said that the news fills the German people with deep grief. All those who have the lucky opportunity to make the personal acquaintanceship of President Kennedy, in particular the people of Berlin, are deeply grieved in this hour. And it's indeed true that in Berlin the reaction is one almost of utter dismay, for President Kennedy has been a hero there ever since his I Am a Berliner speech last June. A city spokesman in Berlin said, "We can only hope that his successor will be as strong in defense of this city as the president was." The German television network has scrapped its evening program of entertainment entirely, has been playing mournful music interspersed with bulletins and a hastily assembled program of news on the assassination. American Ambassador George McGee, who himself comes from Dallas, canceled a white-tie dance scheduled for tonight, and the embassy is now busy phoning 200 guests and telling them that naturally the dance will not be held. For German officials, the death of the president is a catastrophe whose full effects remain to be weighed. They felt they were on the threshold of a fine working relationship between Bonn and Washington, and Chancellor Erhard had been preparing with enthusiasm to fly to Washington to report on the results of his discussions with de Gaulle, from which he's just coming. The assassination has created a sense here of underpinnings of Atlantic policy suddenly being pulled away. And among officials speaking privately before all the official statements have been prepared, there's a tremendous sense of nervousness and unease that Western policy may suffer a great setback.
Well, Dan, don't you think that that feeling is a little bit premature? After all, there's no way of telling whether Lyndon Johnson, as president, will differ in any considerable degree from the policies of President Kennedy.
Dallas, the sentiment is not so much directed against Lyndon Johnson. There's only a feeling that before President Johnson can take control, that there'll be a period of waiting and shifting, and that this will be costly to the alliance. It is not directed in any sense against him. He's hardly known here. He did visit Berlin just almost a week after the wall went up in 1961, and he stopped in Bonn, but that, of course, was so completely overshadowed by President Kennedy's visit last June that they just look at this thing and they say, well, America has to get accustomed to a new president, and the world and the alliance must wait.
Dan, it's interesting that you mentioned the personal affection that many Germans had for the president. Alex Kendrick was mentioning the same thing about the English a few moments ago in a report from London. They seemed to know him personally. He was not just an abstract, remote sort of figure. He was a man whom they knew and understood and liked.
He certainly was not abstract since last June when he had this tremendous success on his visit to Germany. There had been, not so much among the German people as among the top people like Chancellor Adenauer, a suspicion that maybe he was too young, maybe he would sell out German interests because he wanted accommodation with Russia. But from the time that he came here and appeared around the country and flew to Berlin and had this tremendous ovation, there has been a great sense of personal identification with President Kennedy in Germany.
You mentioned the Ich bin ein Berliner speech.
Yes.
Do the people of Berlin still remember that? Was that the first thing they thought about when the president...
in Berlin was the first thing they thought about. This was indeed the first thing. However great is the feeling of loss around Germany, the greatest feeling of loss tonight is in West Berlin.
Our coverage of this special news event continues now from the Wcco-Radio News Bureau. Religious leaders in Minnesota joined in expressions of grief following the president's death. In St. Paul, the president of the Chamber of Commerce recommended that businesses close early this afternoon to permit employees to attend special church services. A Requiem Memorial Mass will be held at the Roman Catholic Cathedral of St. Paul at 5:15 this evening. Other services will be announced as the plans are complete. Suffragan Bishop Philip McNary of the Episcopal Diocese of Minnesota expressed, on behalf of the Protestants of Minnesota, the grief that is felt in homes throughout the state.
The Episcopal Church, through its bishop, the Right Reverend Hamilton Hyatt Kellogg, and his associate, the Right Reverend Philip McNary, express condolence to the family of the late President John Fitzgerald Kennedy, and also shares in the sense of grief and loss suffered by the entire nation in the loss of so courageous and so challenging a president as has now been taken from us. The very fact that this kind of thing can happen in this country places a great responsibility on each of us as citizens, as men, and as Christians, or in whatever posture our faith may be placed, to try to bring about the kind of responsible humanity that would make such a dastardly act impossible in the future.
Bishop Philip McNary of the Episcopal Diocese of Minnesota. And from Temple Israel in Minneapolis, Rabbi Max Shapiro spoke on behalf of the Jewish people of Minnesota.
Our despondent hearts go out to the family of President Kennedy. We grieve so for them, for ourselves, and for the entire human family. We join with all peoples in praying for his soul and for its peace. Heavenly Father, may the soul of John F. Kennedy be bound up in the bond of eternal life. May his repose be peace, O Lord, and grant unto his dear ones and to us and all men thy comfort and solace. Amen.
Most of Minnesota's Roman Catholic bishops are in Rome attending the Ecumenical Council, but the one remaining member of the hierarchy in Minnesota, Bishop Peter Bartholomew of St. Cloud, offered this comment.
And the world is profoundly shocked at the untimely death of President Kennedy. It is difficult to believe that this sad event should have taken place in our nation. We must, however, accept this humiliation and put our complete trust in God's providence, who rules the world and guides the destiny of men and of nations. His death at the hands of a deranged person must serve to bind together bonds of greater unity and purpose amongst all people and classes in our nation. The great causes of peace and the rights and dignity of the human person for which he stood for so gallantly shall be strengthened. In the name of the bishops, priests, and people of the state of Minnesota, I express my profound sorrow and deepest sympathy to his dear wife and family. I call upon all Catholics as well as all citizens of the state of Minnesota to remember our president in their prayers. And as they are thinking about this sad event in the days that lie ahead, that we all realize a greater sense of Christian values in the affairs of men. May his soul and all the souls of the faithful departed, through the mercy of God, rest in peace.
Bishop Bartholomew has directed that a special Requiem Mass in memory of the deceased president will be said early next week at the cathedral in St. Cloud. Archbishop Leo Binns, as we said, is in Rome attending the Ecumenical Council. But in the name of His Excellency Archbishop Leo Binns, the Right Reverend Monsignor John J. Cullinan issued the following statement. In the name of His Excellency Archbishop Leo Binns, I, his Vicar General, scarcely know how to express our grief in behalf of our dead president, to extend our sympathy for his bereaved wife and family, and to beg the prayers of all men of goodwill for Mr. Kennedy and the people of the United States. In Minneapolis, the Minneapolis Symphony Orchestra announced that its concert, scheduled for tonight at Northrop Auditorium, would be performed as a memorial to President Kennedy. In the field of politics, the impact of the president's death was especially profound. We've just been informed that the president's body will arrive in Washington at 6:05 this evening. Minnesota's 2 senators and members of the congressional delegation issued statements from their offices in Washington. Governor Karl Rolvag of Minnesota has now been reached in Omaha, and former Governor Elmer C. Anderson is also standing by for a statement. First, here is a spokesman for Senator Humphrey, who is attending an emergency meeting in Washington.
America has lost a great leader, Senator Humphrey says. The world has lost a great leader. I have lost a good friend. What an incredible tragedy. Our prayers go out to President Johnson. His task is great. His responsibility is unbelievably heavy. He will need the cooperation, faith, and help of every American. He has mine.
That was a spokesman for Minnesota Senator Hubert Humphrey. Senator Eugene McCarthy was obviously shaken by the tragic events of the day.
The city of Washington and the Congress itself are in a state of shock. This is the kind of event which here in Washington people sometimes speculate about, but it's not the kind of day through which one really ever expects to live. And certainly having lived through it, I think that Washington can never be quite the same for those of us who are here and who are close to the government and close to the president. For that matter, I suppose the country in this generation can never be the same as I'm sure the country at the time of the assassination of Abraham Lincoln was not the same or not fully recovered for at least one generation. And I suppose the most striking thing about it is that even the memory of Abraham Lincoln seems to be a little bit dulled and limited and reduced in the face of what happened in Texas today.
Speaking for the Republicans in Congress from Minnesota, Representative Clark McGregor of Minneapolis had the following to say.
The enormity, the barbarity of the crime of presidential assassination staggers human comprehension. My immediate thoughts have been for the well-being and comfort of Mrs. Kennedy and the 2 Kennedy children and all members of President Kennedy's family. It's difficult to try and put into words the feeling that anyone has at this time. I had hoped that we had matured sufficiently in America so that no American would again do what was done to President Lincoln and to President McKinley. Although no evidence is presently before us, this must have been the act of a seriously deranged mind, and one only wonders if science cannot better anticipate the possibility of these things happening so as to prevent them, so as to be able to determine in advance that a mind could conceive and perpetrate such a crime as this. The House of Representatives did not meet formally today, although committees were meeting. The Senate, however, was in session. Most of the members of the House of Representatives were either in committees which immediately terminated all proceedings, or
were in their individual offices. Everything stopped absolutely dead. All telephones, all typewriters, all work in the office of each and every congressman, and all members of the House of Representatives and their staffs gathered around radios that several members do have in their offices. I had none. My staff went across the hall to the office of Congressman McDade from Pennsylvania, and he and his staff and I and members of my staff listened in stunned and in shocked disbelief to the reports from Dallas and from CBS Central News in New York and in Washington.
That was Congressman Clark McGregor. From the Strategic Air Command headquarters in Omaha, where he reached Governor Karl Rolvag, he paid this moving tribute to the dead president.
It is difficult to describe the profound feelings of grief that the great sense of loss of all Americans are experiencing at the death of our president. Thousands of Minnesotans have thrilled to his presence in our state and have rallied to the great ideals he represented and fought for on behalf of all Americans. Throughout America and throughout Minnesota tonight, there is a deep sorrow that this most fearless and determined of leaders has not been allowed to see the fruition of his dreams, the total emancipation and loosening of the spirit of all human beings everywhere in the world. I'm certain that countless millions extend their anguished sympathy to the President's family and friends. In consolation, all we can say is that President Kennedy will live. His principles, his devotion to the welfare of all people, cannot be stilled by the warped minds that launched this assassin's bullet. For what his assassins and those like him do not understand is that you can never kill that which is right, or still that which seeks to ennoble and uplift the existence of all men. There is great anger in our hearts tonight, but I'm certain that if the President had lived, he would have said, "Let us have pity on this man."
So spoke Minnesota Governor Karl Rolvag. And the titular head of the Republican Party in Minnesota, former Governor Elmer L. Anderson, commented as follows.
I am shocked and stunned at the horrible news of President Kennedy's assassination. What a tragedy for our country and for him and his family. My wife and I extend heartfelt sympathy to Mrs. Kennedy and to all members of the Kennedy family. It is to be hoped that a new sense of dedication will be visited on every American to achieve the goals for America for which President Kennedy worked so valiantly and gave his life.
Governor John Reynolds of Wisconsin also talked with WCCO Radio News from the governor's conference in Omaha.
I am shocked and grieved at the death of President Kennedy. The people of Wisconsin will join the nation and the world in mourning the death of this great man. He gave his life for his country, and no man can give more. Our sense of shame at this senseless act is inexpressible. The sympathies of our people are extended to Mrs. Kennedy and the President's family, and our prayers are with them. The people of Wisconsin will join me, I know, and I resolve that decent government must survive this tragedy, that a new dedication to the pursuit of reason and brotherhood must survive this shameful episode in our history. It was my great privilege to have known President Kennedy as a friend. My wife and I extend our sympathies to his family. At the same time, I want to state that I extend my sympathy to President Johnson, the great burdens that he will shoulder. I'm sure that he'll receive the support of all Americans.
So spoke Wisconsin Governor John Reynolds. And the leader of the Wisconsin congressional delegation, Senator William Proxmire, speaks from his office in Washington.
In this hour of grief, our duty is to carry on as President Kennedy would have us carry on. As President Kennedy said once in Wisconsin, the place for an American to be in the hour of death and tribulation is at his post of duty, hard at work. In this spirit, the greatest tribute grateful Americans can pay to President Kennedy is to carry on with all our heart for the great objectives of peace and freedom for which he strives so mightily and so well.
The President of the United States, John F. Kennedy, is dead, assassinated shortly after noon today on the streets of Dallas, Texas. You are listening to a special memorial broadcast from studios Minneapolis and St. Paul, WCCO. One of the liberal legislators in Minnesota, Martin McGowan of Appleton, was at the Minnesota Press Club when the report of the tragic assassination unfolded.
This is Martin McGowan, editor of the Appleton Press. Naturally, all of the United States and all of the world is horrified that a man so widely respected and admired should be struck down in his youth and in a period of great leadership for this nation. At this time, of course, it is not known who would have perpetrated this crime. It is to be hoped it does not bear any political or racial overtones, but anyway, the nation will collect itself and go ahead under a new president.
Also at the Minnesota Press Club was editor Robert Reed of the Breckenridge Gazette-Telegram.
I'm Robert Reed from Gazette-Telegram, Breckenridge.
What are your feelings at this moment?
This is certainly inconceivable. I'm of the opposition party, but President Kennedy was our president, and we all had to respect him, and it is just a terrible thing to have happen to us.
Speaking for the Lutherans of the United States, Dr. Leonard Kendall, president of the Lutheran Church in America, Minnesota Synod, offered this comment.
The Minnesota Synod of the Lutheran Church in America extends to Mrs. Kennedy and all members of the Kennedy family deepest sympathy in this hour of tragedy and sorrow, and prays for the sustaining grace of Almighty God in their behalf. The Synod also urges its people to turn in penitence and prayer to the God of the nations for the strengthening of the moral fiber and the spiritual purposes of our American people, to the end that never again shall there be a recurrence of such a fearful event. One correction, eliminate the again in the last sentence. Okay?
Minnesota's 4 top Republican leaders today issued this statement. We are shocked in disbelief of the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. His loss is a great tragedy. An unconscionable act has been dealt to the President, his family, and the entire nation. Our prayers go to the President's family, and our support as Americans go to the new President, Lyndon Johnson, who takes command at one of America's darkest hours. The statement was issued by State Republican Chairman Robert Forsyth, State Chairwoman Mrs. Nancy Brattis, National Committeeman George Zutzel, and National Committeewoman Mrs. Rhoda Lund. The 4 Minnesota Republican leaders are in St. Louis, where they have been attending a meeting of the Executive Committee of the Republican National Committee. That meeting adjourned when news of the President's death was received. Republican state headquarters in St. Paul has been closed in mourning. You couldn't walk in downtown Twin City areas this afternoon without knowing that something had happened. An elevator girl in one of the hotels summed up the feeling when a passenger tried to make a light comment. I don't think it's time for humor, the girl said, politely but firmly. Airline ticket offices along 7th Avenue were deserted, and several clerks were dabbing at their eyes with handkerchiefs. The stock brokerage firms, normally crowded with closing-hour board watchers, were virtually deserted, with all the exchanges crowded. Employees gathered in small groups, talking not of the market, but of the happening itself. Bells in St. Olaf's Church along 2nd Avenue began tolling shortly after the official announcement was made. The reactions were the same, although each expressed it in their own words. One woman, walking along 7th Street, said that it made one feel as if it wasn't safe to be walking along the streets. What will it mean in the South was another question heard several times. Most were stunned. The feeling that it couldn't happen here summed up things. Stocks fell 21 points today on the news of the President's death. Industrials on the Dow Jones averages were down 21.16, closing at 711.49. Rails down 3.28. Utilities down 1.95. It's 3:35 Central Standard Time. You're listening to special coverage of this historic day from studios Minneapolis and St. Paul, 830 on your radio dial, WCCO. We'll now return to the special CBS network coverage from CBS News headquarters in New York. This report is coming from overseas.
Assassination attempt. The program ended with a bulletin of the president's death. When the first news of the shooting came from Dallas, Italy's President Segni sent a representative to the American embassy for further details. Following the death announcement, President Segni said, "It is a great loss for all humanity." 2 American cardinals who are in Rome for the Ecumenical Council heard the news at the North American College, the graduate seminary for American student priests where they are staying. James Francis Cardinal McIntyre of Los Angeles and Joseph Cardinal Ritter of St. Louis. Cardinal McIntyre issued a joint statement. He said, and I quote, "I have just been at dinner with Cardinal Ritter when we heard the news and were astounded, shocked, and grieved to our hearts. We then had recourse to prayer and called on the student body of the college to join us in prayer for the repose of his soul and for the grief-stricken wife and family." Francis Cardinal Spellman of New York said at his hotel, "President Kennedy is another martyr of his family of heroes." The Italian state television network announced that it would hold 2 extraordinary editions of its national news program at 10 and again at 11 o'clock this evening. All other television programs for the night were canceled. The people of Rome are shaken. In coffee bars, at street corners, at bus stops, in shops that are still open at this hour, the news is everywhere, and the comments are everywhere the same. Spaventoso. It is frightening. Unbelievable. A tragedy. He was so young. Why? Why? It must have been those racists. President Kennedy was loved and admired by ordinary Italians. They remember him from his visit here last June. They were looking forward to another visit by him and by his wife next spring. This is Winston Burdett in Rome.
Winston, are you still there?
I'm still here, yes.
This is Dallas. I imagine that the people of Rome, as they absorb the shock of the death of the president, may also still be thinking about the death not so many months ago of Pope John, whom they also loved and admired.
Well, I think it's true of both deaths, Dallas, that the people of Rome feel it very personally. They do not feel the death of President Kennedy as intimately as they did that of Pope John, but certainly they had a very warm and spontaneous and personal feeling for him.
Is it too early to say, Winston, how the Italian government feels about the possible course of U.S. policy under President Johnson? Do they feel in general that it will continue along the same path as that charted by President Kennedy?
Dallas, I think probably very few men tonight have had time to stop and think about that. I suppose some have, undoubtedly some have at the Italian Foreign Office. I can only guess what they think. I'm quite sure that they think that the course of American foreign policy will remain the same, but at the same time there's never a change of the man, of the person at the helm, at the top, without there being questions and doubts and misgivings in the minds of the leaders of our European allies, whose destiny is so linked to our own. When an American Secretary of State changes, even under the same administration, and perhaps by the appointment of the same president, there are always some questionings and doubts and wonderings about what may happen next.
Winston,
something of that kind is inevitable now, of course, although I think in principle they're fairly firmly convinced that our main course will remain the same.
Winston, have you had any indication as to the plans of the American Cardinals now in Rome? Will they come home and before the end of the current session of the Ecumenical Council?
I do not know. I do not know the answer to that. All I can tell you is that of the 3 cardinals here, with whom I was in contact this evening, none of them mentioned that possibility, but perhaps none of them had yet had time to give it consideration.
Yes. Well, Winston Burdett, thank you very much. I'm sure we'll be talking to you again later on. That was Winston Burdett in Rome. Alan?
Dallas, here in New York, General Douglas MacArthur has sent a telegram to Mrs. Kennedy saying, "I realize the utter futility of words at such a time, but the world of civilization shares the poignancy of this monumental tragedy. As a former comrade in arms, his death killed something within me." The reaction of General Douglas MacArthur. Senator Barry Goldwater issued a statement from his Washington office declaring the assassination shocking and dreadful. He said, "The president's death is a profound loss to the nation and the free world. He and I were personal friends. It is also a great loss to me. Mrs. Goldwater and I offer our heartfelt sympathies to Mrs. Kennedy and the president's family." The senator learned of the assassination personally from a passerby at Chicago's O'Hare Airport, where he was traveling to Muncie, Indiana in his private plane. He expressed immediate shock and grief, but otherwise remained silent. New York's Governor Rockefeller held a news conference to express his shock and dismay at the tragedy. Here is that story by CBS News correspondent Bernard Eisman.
New York's Governor Rockefeller has proclaimed a 30-day period of mourning for New York State. He also said that on the day of the president's funeral, all state offices will be closed. Looking grief-stricken and obviously shocked, Mr. Rockefeller met newsmen to read a brief statement. This, he said, is a shocking and terrible tragedy for the nation and the world. Mrs. Rockefeller and I join with all New Yorkers and every American in extending heartfelt sympathy to Mrs. Kennedy and the president's family. Governor Rockefeller continued, "May God grant strength and guidance to Lyndon Johnson as he assumes his grave responsibilities under these tragic circumstances. The prayers," said Rockefeller, "of all of us will be with him." Governor Rockefeller permitted no political questions after he made his statement. This is Bernard Eisman at Governor Rockefeller's office in New York.
One of the most detailed stories to come in yet on the assassination this afternoon has been written and filed by Bob Jackson, a photographer, staff photographer of the Dallas Times-Herald. He was riding in a car close behind the presidential car, and his story has just been written and filed by the Associated Press. In this, photographer Bob Jackson says, "There were 5 of us in the car. When we heard the first shot, the president had already turned the corner. We had not made the corner yet. Then we heard 2 more shots. As far as I know, 3 shots were all I heard. I just instinctively looked that way. First, somebody joked about it being a firecracker. Then, since I was facing the building where the shots were coming from, I just glanced up and saw 2 colored men in a window straining to look at a window up above them. As I looked up to the window above, I saw a rifle being pulled back in the window. It might have been resting on the window sill. I didn't see a man. I didn't even see if it had a scope on it." And this personal eyewitness story by photographer Bob Jackson continues. He says, "It was the 2nd floor down from the top of the building, and it was the end window facing Elm Street, the corner window. The president's car was about halfway between Houston Street and the underpass. We were beginning to turn the corner. The gunman had about a 45-degree angle from the building to the president's car. I looked to my left, and I could see both cars speeding off, the president's car and the car behind him carrying the vice president. They disappeared under the underpass. Then I could see a colored family covering up their child on the grass. A policeman was down on his knee. I couldn't tell if he were hit. I thought the child was dead or something. Then the Negro parents picked up the boy and ran. As soon as I saw the rifle, I knew someone was trying to kill them, but it never entered my mind that he could be dead. I just couldn't believe it at first." And the photographer who wrote that story, Bob Jackson, says, "It's going to give Dallas an awful bad name, I think. The general reaction of all the guys around me was that they just couldn't believe a thing like that could happen here." We will continue with the present programming on the CBS radio network, and all regularly scheduled programs and commercial announcements will be discontinued until further notice. We're going to pause again to allow our stations to identify themselves. We will take a 5-second pause for stations to make station identification. This is the CBS radio network.
34 degrees in the Twin Cities. Studios, Minneapolis, St. Paul, 830 WCCO.
Back at CBS News headquarters in New York, with further details and coverage of the tragedy that has occurred to this nation and the world this afternoon in the assassination of President Kennedy in Dallas, Texas. My colleague, Dallas Townsend, is sitting here and compiling and has compiled a story on other assassinations in our history. Dallas?
Alan, as we look back on the last turbulent 100 years of American history, it's ironic to note that the incumbent president has died approximately once every 20 years. In 1865, Abraham Lincoln was shot and killed by John Wilkes Booth. He was succeeded by Andrew Johnson. In 1881, President Garfield was shot and killed. Garfield lingered for about 2 months before he died. In 1901, President McKinley was shot and killed, and he lasted for about 10 days. He was succeeded, of course, by Theodore Roosevelt, the young and vigorous Republican president. In 1923, Warren Harding died of a sudden illness. I believe he was in San Francisco at the time. He was succeeded by Calvin Coolidge. In 1945, just 22 years later, Franklin D. Roosevelt died of a cerebral hemorrhage at Warm Springs, Georgia. He was succeeded by Harry Truman. And now today, in 1963, 18 years after the death of President Roosevelt, John F. Kennedy has been shot and killed. So that over the past 100 years, beginning just 98 years ago with the death of Lincoln, 6 presidents have died in office, 4 of them violently, all of them from gunshot wounds by an assassin.
And now the latest addition to that chapter, President Kennedy. His body is being flown back to Andrews Air Force Base in Maryland, where it is due to arrive about an hour and 15 minutes from now. On board the same presidential jet plane is Mrs. Kennedy and the new president of the United States, Lyndon Johnson, who was sworn in just before the plane took off from Dallas by a federal judge, Sarah Hughes.
Interesting to note, Alan, this is the first time that a president has been sworn in by a woman, Federal Judge Sarah Hughes, and it's also the first time that a president has been sworn in on board a plane. The swearing-in occurred on the presidential transport Air Force One just before it left Dallas, Texas.
Here in New York, former President Eisenhower has issued a statement on the death of President Kennedy at a news conference which he held this afternoon at the Waldorf Astoria. Here is the recorded excerpt of President Eisenhower's news conference.
I share the sense of shock and dismay that the entire nation must feel at the despicable act that took the life of the nation's president. On the personal side, Mrs. Eisenhower and I share the grief that Mrs. Kennedy must now feel, and we send to her our prayerful thoughts and sympathetic sentiments in this hour.
General, how would you counsel the American people at this time?
In the face of such a terrible thing, I'm sure the entire citizenry of the nation will join as one man in expressing not only their grief, but their indignation at this act, and will stand faithfully behind the government.
General, could you tell us how you got the word?
I was at a meeting for the United Nations, and while there, a member of the meeting was called out and came back and told us the news. Although at that time, we did not know the president was dead. We did not know when I got back here at that time that he was dead. But, matter of fact, we had the last message we had was one rather of hope. And the entire company merely paused for a minute at the request of the chairman, and each of us, in his own way, said a silent prayer for the president.
Should there be any concern, sir, over national security at a time like this?
No, I think the whole nation now would be almost all of us security agents.
General Eisenhower, will the nation be all right in a few months ahead?
Oh, I'm not going to predict anything of that. I just say this. The American nation is a people of great common sense, and they are not going to be stampeded or bewildered.
General, how in history have assassinations affected the political course of events?
Well, of course, in Lincoln's assassination, the presidency went to a man who was a registered Democrat, Mr. Johnson. In Garfield, I doubt that there was any. And, of course, in McKinley, that brought in Theodore Roosevelt. Of course, there have been other attempts in late years. Mr. Truman was at a grave threat to his life, and Mr. Roosevelt, just before he was inaugurated, you remember, down when Mayor Cermak was killed, ran a very grave risk. These things have happened, and it seems inexplicable to me, because Americans are loyal. And it's just this occasional psychopathic sort of accident that occurs, and I don't know what we can do about it.
Could you say anything, General, about how people will feel abroad from all your experience with the United Nations and others? How will it be taken abroad?
Well, I think they will be a bit bewildered. This, in the civilized countries of the world, this doesn't happen so often. And you remember in the starting of World War I, the murder of the Archduke Ferdinand, I think his name was. Well, this itself almost, is one of the contributory causes to that war. And, but here, I just don't know what happens. But we are a nation that where our freedoms are allowed, or are observed in such a way that everybody is ready everybody is, you might say, capable of doing this if he's ready to put his own life on the line.
General, how will you spend the rest of today and tomorrow? How will you spend the rest of today and tomorrow and into the weekend?
Okay. I have canceled the dinner date that I had for tonight. Tomorrow, I'm going immediately to my home, and if I'm wanted for any purpose whatsoever, I will, of course, be available.
Would you have any advice for the American people at this time, General?
No, as I said, I know the American people will stand solid, and they will not be stampeded.
Thank you, Mr. President.
All right.
Thank you.
That was General Eisenhower talking with reporters this afternoon in New York and discussing the assassination of President Kennedy. Here is a chronology of Mr. Kennedy's final hours. At 8:45 a.m. Central Standard Time, the president walked bareheaded and without a coat through a misty rain into a parking lot across the street from Fort Worth's Hotel Texas. He spoke there to a cheering throng of Democrats who could not get tickets to see him at a breakfast appearance, and he apologized because Mrs. Kennedy was not with him. He said that she was organizing herself, and that takes longer. At 9 a.m., the president and Mrs. Kennedy attended the breakfast in the Hotel Texas. The breakfast was sponsored by the Fort Worth Chamber of Commerce. Mrs. Kennedy walked in some minutes late, and her entrance brought tremendous applause from the 2,500 guests. Both of them were given Texas boots, and the president got a Texas hat. He declined to put it on in public, joking that he would wear it at the White House next Monday. At 10:35 a.m., this is still Central Standard Time, the president and Mrs. Kennedy left the Texas Hotel by auto for Carswell Air Force Base near Fort Worth and their short flight to Dallas, Texas. At 11:37 a.m., the presidential plane, Air Force One, landed at Love Field in Dallas. Mrs. Kennedy came out from the plane smiling and shaking hands with airport greeters. She carried a bouquet of red roses. Several young men in the crowd shouted, "Hey, Jackie," and they moved forward for a closer look. Several young girls were screaming with excitement as they saw the president as he made his way through the crowd. There was no sign of anti-Kennedy sentiment. They left in a motorcade that was to take them over an 11-mile route, including downtown Dallas. At 12:30 p.m., the motorcade approached a triple underpass which feeds into Stemmons Expressway, the 5-lane route to the Dallas Trade Mart where Mr. Kennedy was to make a luncheon speech. A series of rifle shots rang out. The president fell face down on the back seat of his car, a bullet in his head. Governor John Connolly, who was sitting beside him, slumped down on the car seat, wounded in the back. Mrs. Kennedy grasped her husband's head. She gasped, "Oh, no." The motorcade raced to Parkland Hospital near the Trade Mart. Mr. Kennedy was taken to the extreme emergency ward, where he received a blood transfusion and then extreme unction from Catholic priests. At 1 p.m. Central Standard Time, the president died. And now for a report on Soviet reaction to the president, we're going to hear again from CBS News correspondent Stuart Novins in Moscow.
The word has spread rapidly through this city. It's after midnight, about 1 in the morning, actually. It's snowing. The temperature is below freezing. The streets were fairly empty when the news was first broadcast here in Russian at 10:30 Friday night. First, there was the radio bulletin that the president had been shot. Then, that he was in critical condition. And then Radio Moscow interrupted a sports program. The announcer told his listeners that President Kennedy was dead, that he had been shot apparently by right-wing extremists. The sports program was discontinued. When the news bulletin was over, it was followed by organ music. The same bulletin interrupted a television program. The announcer first read the details of the attack in Dallas. Then a messenger walked into the picture, the first time that's ever happened here, and handed the announcer the final bulletin. The announcer's head rose slowly from the script that had just been handed him, and looking full-face into the camera, he said, "President Kennedy is dead." The television picture turned to black, and instead of the regular program that was to follow, only music was heard, the strains of Tchaikovsky's Symphonie Pathétique. The few people on the streets who had heard the bulletins earlier gave reporters reactions of shock. One man said, "What's the matter with those right-wing people?" Another said, after being told about the assassination by a reporter, "Who will stop Goldwater now?" A woman, her voice suddenly frightened, said, "Will there be war? Will the new president want war?" At the Soviet Foreign Ministry, the night duty officer told Western reporters, "There is no official announcement yet. Wait for tomorrow." Then, in one conversation, he said, "To you personally, I must say, I am sorry, truly sorry." American students at Moscow University, there are about 20, were first stunned and unbelieving, and then, when doubt could no longer be a refuge, they stood in shock groups. Their friends among Russian students, one American said, came almost shyly to offer their sympathy and condolence. And then the talk became political. What would happen to America now? What would happen to the spirit of Moscow? What would happen in next year's election? One Russian student said, "Kennedy was a bigger man than Eisenhower." Another said, "It's frightful, barbarous." That reaction was echoed by a woman in Red Square. "How can such things happen in a civilized country?" she demanded, almost angrily, of an American reporter. We talked with United States Ambassador Foy Kohler shortly after the first announcement here, which came on the Voice of America in English. His voice on the telephone was almost muddled by grief. "I'm devastated," he said. "I don't know what I feel. I feel terrible." The Voice of America did carry the first news of the assassination to be heard here. The English-language voice broadcasts have not been jammed since the nuclear test ban treaty was signed. Foreign Minister Gromyko called Ambassador Kohler at midnight tonight, about an hour ago, and expressed his personal shock and greatest sympathy to the American people. He said that official condolences will be coming later from the highest level. Radio Moscow, after the first bulletin of the president's death, gave a political biography of John Fitzgerald Kennedy. It referred to him as an outstanding American and statesman, and it announced that Lyndon Johnson had taken on the duties of the presidency. This reporter felt a sharp and poignant emotion when, shortly after the first announcement on Soviet radio, a Russian friend called simply to say, "I am so sorry." He fumbled in trying to express his emotions and then broke off sharply to almost shout into the phone, "It's a shame, it shouldn't happen." And then he rang off. It was almost as if he had suffered a personal loss. Moscow television has gone off the air now. Radio Moscow has closed down. This is a dark city at night. It's darker tonight than I have ever seen it. This is Stuart Novins in Moscow.
Stuart, this is Dallas Townsend.
Yes, Dallas.
We've all been sitting here listening to that immensely dramatic account of the Soviet reaction, the initial Soviet reaction to the death of the president. And I think I understood you to say that Foreign Minister Gromyko has already expressed his personal sympathy.
Yes, he telephoned the ambassador at Spaso House just about an hour ago. He expressed his personal shock to the ambassador, and he offered his greatest sympathy to the American people, and he said that there would be an official message of condolence that would come from the highest level, of course, from Premier Khrushchev and President Brezhnev.
Yes. Is there any indication when that message will be forthcoming?
I would imagine it would not be before morning, but that is morning here, Moscow time. That would be 8 hours after New York time.
Yes. All of us have been struck by what is perfectly obvious in everything that you have said, the genuine sense of Russian dismay and horror at the death of the president.
There can be no doubt about that, Dallas. There can be no doubt about how genuine it is from the people we've talked to, people on the street, not official people, just ordinary people who work for a living and live and have their problems just like people anywhere else in the world. They're terribly disturbed, Dallas, because this is a sudden, sharp, abrupt change at a very critical time. These are very political people. The newspapers are political. They feed political information. Everyone here, of course, knows about the nuclear test ban agreement. Everyone knows about what has been called so often here the spirit of Moscow. And they're deeply concerned, the individuals are, as to what will happen now. What will the American policy be? What will this mean not only in the immediate future, what does it mean in terms of Berlin, in terms of Germany? They've been told often, over and over again, in all the press media here, that there are militant circles, aggressive circles in the United States, They've had quotations thrown at them from some of our, shall I say, irresponsible types in Washington. And these have been quoted as representing a large percentage of public opinion in the United States, where most of us, I think, would agree that they were small. But they believe that there are such forces in the United States, and they're terribly afraid now that those forces may emerge to take over control of policy of the United States, and that could mean serious difficulties between East and West.
Stuart, I think it is fair to say, is it not, that the Russian people had a warm feeling for the president. He was not just a far-off figure who was the head of perhaps the principal opposition to the Russian
I
nation.
wouldn't say it was a warm feeling, because they never really knew him personally, but I think they had a feeling of respect for the man.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a respect for integrity, and it was a respect, I think, an acceptance of the fact that the president, Mr. Kennedy, wanted peace.
What do you think the average Russian knows about Lyndon Johnson, the new president?
I don't think he's ever heard of him. That's one of the things that makes this such a shocking thing. They don't know what's going to come next. They don't know anything about Lyndon Johnson's background or what he stands for or what kind of leadership he'll give to the United States. They don't know whether he can handle what they believe to be the so-called militant circles. These are all great big question marks now.
Stuart, thank you very much. We'll be back to you later on. That was CBS News correspondent Stuart Novins reporting the latest Russian reaction from Moscow. Now back to Alan Jackson.
Dallas, we have a special announcement by Frank Stanton, who is president of the Columbia Broadcasting System. In respect for the feelings of a shocked nation, the CBS television network and the CBS radio network will carry no commercial announcements and no entertainment programs until after the president's funeral. CBS will continue to bring all the news relating to this tragic event, memorials and special broadcasts, and all other news of importance throughout this period. That was a special announcement by Frank Stanton, president of Columbia Broadcasting System, announcing that CBS television and CBS radio networks will carry no commercial announcements and no entertainment programs until after the president's funeral.
Alan, we're going to switch now from our CBS News headquarters to the president's hometown, Boston, Massachusetts, where Richard Cardinal Cushing, a very close, longtime friend of the Kennedy family, has been reported in seclusion since the tragic news became public. So we'll switch now to station WEEI and Arthur W. Smith.
In the shadow of our dead president's Boston residence on Beacon Hill, workmen are putting the finishing touches on the Christmas decorations on Boston Common. At this hour, the mayor of Boston and the governor of the Commonwealth were scheduled to throw switches, ushering in the season of lights and Christmas festivities. I have just seen literally hundreds of lights being turned on. These are the candles and vigil lights of the downtown chapels. Thousands of Bostonians are streaming into these chapels, Catholic chapels, Protestant houses of worship. All wear a stunned expression. Some make no effort to hold back the tears streaming down their faces. Some women walking into the Arch Street Chapel in the heart of the shopping district wear paper napkins on their heads, testifying to the haste with which they turn to their faith. Children, led by tearful mothers, murmured aloud their prayers, not quite comprehending the tragedy.
Richard Cardinal Cushing, the Roman Catholic Archbishop of Boston, is en route to Hyannisport to console the sorrowing parents. The Cardinal, who married President Kennedy and Jacqueline Bouvier, called the president's death today a martyrdom for the free world. This is Vin Maloney with Arthur Smith in Boston, returning you to CBS News in New York.
It might be recalled that Cardinal Cushing also delivered a memorable prayer at the inauguration of President Kennedy in January 1961. One of our reporters was on his way to work here in New York when he heard the news on his car radio that the president had been shot. He reports that a few minutes later, traffic on the Long Island Expressway began to slow down and then came to a halt. Several people left their automobiles. A few women gathered in a group. All of them were crying. None said anything. They just cried. Then our reporter stopped and turned toward his car. He folded his arms against the top of the car and buried his face in them. Now back to Alan Jackson.
We're getting more information now from Dallas on the suspect that is being held in the Kennedy assassination. So for that report, let's switch to correspondent Nelson Benton in Dallas.
A 24-year-old man from Fort Worth, Texas, is being questioned this afternoon by Dallas police in connection with the assassination of President Kennedy. The man, Lee Harvey Oswald, was arrested at a theater about 3 miles from the spot where the president was killed. He was arrested after a policeman attempting to make the arrest was shot and killed at the theater. So far, there has been no word on his being officially charged in the assassination. Oswald's arrest followed a quick police search that was spread out in the vicinity of the Dallas School Book Depository, the building from which it's believed the president was shot. A field near the area was searched. A rifle was found on the 6th floor. It was shortly after that the gunfight ensued at the theater about 3 miles away. Oswald was taken into questioning. He's being questioned now. This is Nelson Denton in Dallas, Texas.
Texas Governor John Connally was riding in the same limousine with President Kennedy and suffered serious wounds from the assassin's bullets. But we have been told that Governor Connally is in satisfactory condition, although serious condition. One of the latest reports on the condition of the Governor Connally is that there is no reason to believe at this time, that is in the usual post-operative recovery period, that the Texas governor will not achieve a complete recovery. He was lucid during the time preceding the operation. One bullet went through his chest, striking the 5th rib and doing considerable damage in that area, including a portion of the lung. The bullet emerged, striking Governor Connally's wrist, causing damage to the radial wrist bone, and then went further to hit the governor's thigh. The latter 2 injuries are considered reasonably minor. The doctors believe that Governor Connally of Texas, barring some unforeseen complication, will make a complete recovery. House Speaker John McCormick has announced that President Kennedy's body will lie in state at the White House tomorrow. McCormick said he thinks the body will be taken to the Capitol Sunday to remain in the Great Rotunda until about noon Monday. Further plans are indefinite, but it's understood the actual funeral services will be held in Boston. Traditionally, the presidents who die in office have lain in state in the Rotunda. Pentagon officials expect the funeral to be a full-dress state ceremony. Preparations are going ahead on that assumption. A well-informed source says the president's body will be taken to Bethesda Naval Hospital tonight, and President Johnson will go to the White House. It isn't certain at the moment whether President Johnson will spend the night at the White House this evening. UN Ambassador Adlai Stevenson has issued a comment on the assassination that took place today. So for the recorded excerpt of Ambassador Stevenson's press conference, we hear now from the tape room.
The tragedy of this day is beyond instant comprehension. All of us who knew him will bear the grief of his death to the day of ours. And all men everywhere who love peace and justice and freedom will bow their heads. At such a moment, we can only turn to prayer. Prayer to comfort our grief, to sustain Mrs. Kennedy and his family, to strengthen President Johnson, and to guide us in time to come. May God help us.
Ambassador Adlai Stevenson as he spoke at the United Nations this afternoon. And now, CBS News correspondent Wells Church is standing by in Washington to bring us word from the man who is next in line to the presidency after President Lyndon Johnson, the Speaker of the House, Representative McCormick. Here is Wells Church on Capitol Hill.
That is John W. McCormick, the Speaker of the House, of course, as much affected as anyone here, because, as Alan Jackson just said, he is now the number 2 man in this government. He would ascend to the presidency if anything should happen to our new president, Lyndon Johnson. This is what the Speaker had to say when he learned of Mr. Kennedy's death.
The tragic death of President Kennedy is a great loss, not only to our country, but to the entire world. President Kennedy was giving to our country and to the free world visionary, sterling, and courageous leadership so necessary during this trying period of the world's history. The bullet of the assassin has taken from our midst one of the great Americans of all time. The world in addition to our country, the people of our country will mourn not only the passing of this great man, but the dastardly manner in which his death took place. I have lost a dear and personal friend, and I and Mrs. McCormick, with the rest of the people of the nation, mourn the passing of our great president and our outstanding leader. I know that all Americans join with me and Mrs. McCormick in extending to Mrs. Kennedy and the other loved ones of the family of our late president our deepest sympathy in their bereavement. While he has left us, he takes his place in history. And I know that if he could speak to us from the great beyond, that he would say to you and I, all Americans, whether we occupy official life or not, carry on and see that your children and your children's children live under the same form of government that we have today. So from the sacrifices, the leadership, the dedicated service of President Kennedy, let us renew our confidence in the future of our country. Let us renew our love of our country, and let us go forth determined to follow the spirit of President Kennedy with faith and with confidence, meeting all challenges and all obstacles that might occur, and to lead us through the leadership, his spirit, the spirit of President Kennedy and the leadership of President Johnson, to a world of peace.
Thus, the message of John W. McCormick, the Speaker of the House of Representatives. Mr. McCormick is from Massachusetts. This is Wells Church in Washington.
The CBS radio network will program continuously on the story of the death of President John Kennedy and subsequent developments until further notice. We're going to pause again briefly to allow our stations to identify themselves. We will take a 5-second pause for station identification. This is the CBS radio network.
Studio St. Paul, Minneapolis, 830 WCCO.
Tragedy that occurred this afternoon in Mexico City. A customs official says that the border between the United States and Mexico was sealed immediately after the assassination of President Kennedy. The Mexican official said the order closing the frontier was issued by United States authorities this afternoon. And now we have been getting more details on the tragedy, and there is a curious, at least, coincidence of people being held and questioned in the shooting this afternoon. Here's Dallas Townsend with that.
Alan, the only man who is known to be under arrest at the moment is Lee H. Oswald, who is said to be 24 years old, and he was arrested not in connection with the assassination of the president, but in connection with the killing of a Dallas policeman whose name is given as J.D. Tippit. The first report we had was that a Secret Service man had been killed. That turned out to be erroneous. But a Dallas, Texas police officer, J.D. Tippit, was killed. And this 24-year-old man, Lee H. Oswald, has been arrested and is being questioned in connection with that killing. Now, he's identified in a report we have from Dallas as chairman of a Fair Play for Cuba committee. Police in Dallas say that Oswald was accused in the slaying of Officer Tippit shortly after the shooting of the president. Police Captain Pat Ganaway says the suspect is an employee in the building where a rifle was found. Now, presumably that is the rifle that was used to assassinate the president. Ganaway says the suspect had visited Russia and was married to a Russian. This has not been confirmed. The Associated Press tells us that Oswald returned to his home in Fort Worth, Texas from Russia last year after having been in the Soviet Union since 1959. According to the Associated Press, Oswald spent his time in Russia working in a factory in Minsk and left only after he apparently became disillusioned with life in Russia. He had gone there after his discharge from the United States Marines and announced that he wanted to remain there. However, according to the Associated Press, he had a change of heart and applied for a passport in the autumn of 1962, last year, saying that he wanted to return to the United States with the Russian wife, whom he had met and married while in the Soviet Union. They are said to have one child. The passport was issued, and Soviet authorities granted exit permits for Oswald and his wife and child. It was in 1959, after he defected to the Soviet Union, this is still on the authority of the Associated Press, that Oswald told American embassy officials in Moscow that he had applied for Soviet citizenship. It was apparently sometime after that that he changed his mind. We have nothing further on this man named Lee H. Oswald. So far, he has not been charged. He is being questioned in connection with the fatal shooting of Dallas police officer J.D. Tippit. Alan?
The White House has announced that President Lyndon Johnson will meet at the White House this evening with Defense Secretary McNamara and White House National Security Aide McGeorge Bundy, and then he will confer with the bipartisan leadership of Congress. President Johnson is flying back to Washington now from Dallas aboard the presidential jet plane, the same plane that is bringing President Kennedy's body back, and also returning Mrs. Kennedy to the Capitol. White House sources say that President Kennedy's body will be taken to Bethesda Naval Hospital when it arrives this evening. President Johnson will be flown directly to the White House from Andrews Air Force Base in suburban Maryland. Newsmen were told at late afternoon that the Kennedy children had not yet been told of the death of their father. This presumably would be done by Mrs. Kennedy. Officials say that the President's brother-in-law, Sergeant Shriver, is making arrangements for the funeral in connection with military officials.
Studio St. Paul, Minneapolis, WCCO. General Manager Larry Haig of WCCO-Radio announced that the entire regular schedule of programs on this station is being preempted for special news broadcasts and a memorial broadcast, which will continue for the balance of the day. Here are some announcements. Cancellations of events in CCO land due to the President's death. Minneapolis Public Schools have canceled the high school basketball exhibition game scheduled for tonight in the Minneapolis Auditorium. This has been canceled. School officials said that an athletic exhibition does not seem appropriate tonight and ordered all flags lowered to half-mast in Minneapolis until after memorial services. Eden Prairie Watertown basketball game is canceled. The Austin De La Salle basketball game is also canceled. All meetings scheduled for John W. Macy, chairman of the U.S. Civil Service Commission, on Monday and Tuesday. Those meetings in the Twin Cities have been canceled. The Minnesota Amusement Company's entire circuit will be closed for all matinee performances the day of President Kennedy's funeral. Another cancellation, the Amory versus Baldwin-Woodville basketball game has been postponed until a future date. And the Minneapolis Symphony will go on tonight. However, tonight's program will be performed in memory of the President. The Sadie Hawkins dance, which was to have been held tonight at St. Paul Monroe High School, has been canceled. The Shrine Temple Vaudeville show to be held at Robbinsdale High School has been canceled tonight. And Father Finn of St. Mary's School in White Bear Lake has canceled religious instruction for all grade school children tomorrow and Sunday. 2 operettas scheduled for tonight at Bethany College in Mankato, Minnesota, have been canceled. They will be presented tomorrow night and Sunday night as originally scheduled. A wrestling match, Sibley High School versus Brooklyn Center High School, has been canceled. That was scheduled for tonight. That has been canceled. Yellow Medicine County Republican Rally in Clarkfield, Minnesota, scheduled for tomorrow night, has been canceled. And the Twin Cities Catholic Mixer, which was to be held tonight in the Prom Ballroom in St. Paul, has been canceled. Here is a list of special church services to be held today and tonight. A service of prayer at 7 o'clock this evening at the Mount Olive Lutheran Church, Chicago Avenue and 31st Street, Minneapolis. There is a service from 5 until 8 tonight at Christ Methodist Church at 2500 Hudson Road in St. Paul. There is a solemn Requiem High Mass at the Cathedral of St. Paul in St. Paul and at the Basilica of St. Mary in Minneapolis. That is at 5:15 p.m. A service at 8 this evening at McAllister Presbyterian Church, 1658 Lincoln Avenue, St. Paul. There will be a Mass for the Dead at St. Rose of Lima Church at 2072 North Hamlin, St. Paul at 8:30 p.m. tonight. A memorial prayer service will be held at the University Lutheran Church of Hope, 601 13th Avenue Southeast, Minneapolis at 7 tonight. At 7 tonight, a memorial service and prayers at St. Christopher's Episcopal Church at 2300 Hamlin North in Roseville. There will be a High Requiem Mass at St. Olaf Catholic Church in downtown Minneapolis at 5:30. A special service will be held at 6 o'clock tonight at Holy Trinity Lutheran Church at 28th Avenue and 31st Street, Minneapolis. A special service will be held at 7:30 tonight at Lutheran Church of the Redeemer, Dale and Carroll in St. Paul, and a Requiem Mass at St. Pascal's Catholic Church at 3rd Street and White Bear Avenue in St. Paul at 5:30 this evening. And combined memorial services of the 4 churches in the St. Anthony Park area, Episcopal, Methodist, Congregational, and Lutheran, memorial services combined will be held at St. Anthony Park Lutheran Church beginning at 5:30. That's at 2323 Como Avenue in St. Paul. The WAMSO, W-A-M-S-O, Post-Symphony Party at the Gaslight tonight has been canceled. Those are cancellations, and we'll be bringing you up to date as those cancellations come into our WCCO Radio News Bureau. The latest word in the weather that you should be aware of, because hazardous driving warnings have been issued for parts of Minnesota for the northeast tonight. The clouds will diminish, and it's going to become much colder. Occasional snow is expected in the northeast portion tonight, and Saturday, tomorrow, the weather will be generally fair but colder. Occasional cloudiness and continued cold weather tomorrow night, with scattered light snow or snow flurries in the northern portions. The expected lows tonight in Minnesota, 0 in the northwest, to 15 above in the southeast. Highs tomorrow will range from 10 to 25. Here's the Twin Cities forecast. Cold weather in sight. Diminishing cloudiness, much colder. And tomorrow it will be fair and colder. Occasional cloudiness and a little colder Saturday night. Winds northwesterly at 10 to 15 miles per hour tonight and Saturday. The low expected tonight in our Twin Cities, 12 above. High tomorrow, 20. The low Saturday night will be 5 above, so there is a cold trend and a hazardous driving warning for the northeast portion of Minnesota that you should be aware of. There's very light snow falling right now in Alexandria, light rain at La Crosse. Most other points reporting clear to partly cloudy skies. It's 26 minutes past 4 o'clock, 30 degrees in our Twin Cities under cloudy skies. We take you now back to CBS Net Alert News. Dallas Townsend of CBS, George Herman of CBS, Alan Jackson, Alexander Kendrick in London, Daniel Shore in Bonn, Stuart Novins in Moscow, bringing you up to date on the latest developments on the president's death. We now return you to CBS Radio in New York.
That is quite true, of course, Dallas.
So it's also interesting to point out that if he does make it, and there's no way of telling whether he will be the second prime minister who is half American. The first one was Winston Churchill.
That's right. In Berlin, by the way, there was a curious and interesting reaction. West Berlin's mayor, Willy Brandt, went on the radio and television a short while ago and called on all Berliners to put lighted candles in their windows tomorrow night in commemoration of President Kennedy. Willy Brandt said, "Berlin has lost its best friend with the death of the first citizen of the world." He said a flame had been extinguished for everyone hoping for a just peace and a better life. And interestingly, within minutes after Brandt's statement, asking for candles to be lighted in windows tomorrow night, the first candles began to appear in windows all over Berlin tonight. In Washington, British Ambassador Sir David Ormsby Gore, a personal and longtime friend of the late president, said, "This horrible, wicked, and senseless act has deprived not only the American people, but the world of a great and wonderful man. Jack Kennedy was the best and most loyal friend one could ever hope to have, and I feel a sense of loss beyond description."
Cardinal Cushing, Alan, has now issued a statement. The Cardinal, who was a very long-time family friend, who christened both of the Kennedy children, Caroline and John Jr., who married Senator Kennedy and Jacqueline Bouvier in 1953, and who made a prayer at the president's inaugural. Cardinal Cushing is now on his way to Hyannisport to be with the Kennedy family, but he has issued this statement, in which he says, "My heart is broken with grief over his martyrdom for the cause of a free world. John Fitzgerald Kennedy, known to me for a lifetime and loved by me as a devoted friend, has laid down his life for us all. Greater love than this no man hath. Since the day he assumed the office of president, he exemplified in his life, as in his death, the title of his famous book, Profiles in Courage. I recall that in his inauguration address, he stated that he would not shrink from his responsibilities. He has been faithful to that pledge even unto death." And Cardinal Cushing adds, "I pray especially that the youth of this world, and particularly in America, will take a lesson from his courageous words and deeds and work for freedom, equality, and justice, which his youthful vigor sought for all the peoples of this earth. May God rest the noble soul of this youthful martyr. That's the statement issued a few moments ago by Richard Cardinal Cushing, the Archbishop of Boston, the longtime friend and intimate of the Kennedy family, the man who married the President and Jacqueline Bouvier just a bit more than 10 years ago.
Dallas, French President de Gaulle has sent a message to Mrs. Kennedy saying, "The immense sorrow which has stricken you moves my wife and I from the bottom of our hearts. Please accept our assurance that we are with you in thought and in prayer. President Kennedy will never be forgotten." Another message from de Gaulle to new President Lyndon Johnson pledged the faithful and confident friendship of France for the United States of America. Even across the Iron Curtain, messages of sympathy are being expressed. East Germany's communist leader Walter Ulbricht announced that he had learned the news of the president's death with sadness and with deep indignation. Ulbricht expressed sympathy for the American people who had lost what he called one of the most outstanding statesmen. Our neighbors to the north have expressed extreme sorrow and dismay at the assassination of President Kennedy. That reaction has been summed up for us by CBS newsman Peter Stursberg in Ottawa.
The Canadian House of Commons adjourned minutes after it met this afternoon as a mark of grief at the death of President Kennedy. The Canadian flag atop the Parliament buildings was lowered to half-mast. Prime Minister Lester Pearson announced President Kennedy's death to the House when he was handed a bulletin while he was making a statement expressing the feeling of all of us of shock and grief at the news of the attempt on the life of the President of the United States. Mr. Pearson stopped and then said, "I've just been informed that President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. A gasp went up from the crowded benches in the House. The Canadian Prime Minister went on, "A heartbreaking tragedy has occurred. The world can ill afford at this time in our history to lose a man of his courage." The former Conservative Prime Minister, John Diefenbaker, whose relations with Mr. Kennedy had not been the best, declared that a tribune of freedom has gone. This is Peter Stursberg in Ottawa.
Back at our CBS News headquarters in New York, the White House has announced that President Johnson will make his first statement as chief executive at Andrews Air Force Base when the presidential jet arrives from Dallas about 6:15, roughly 45 minutes from now. After the new president makes his statement, he will fly to the White House aboard a helicopter to meet with Secretary of Defense McNamara and McGeorge Bundy, the special assistant to the late President Kennedy on national security affairs. A White House spokesman says that Johnson will confer at the White House at 8 o'clock this evening with Democratic and Republican leaders of the House and the Senate. We perhaps should report once more that Governor Connolly of Texas, who was seriously wounded in the assassination episode this afternoon, is considered to be, although in serious condition, not in critical condition. He underwent surgery, and the doctors say that from all indications he will make a complete recovery.
Alan, we were hearing a few moments ago from Peter Stursberg about the sense of shock and alarm in Ottawa, and now we understand that Alex Kendrick is back on the line from London to tell us something about the latest British reaction there. Alex?
Yes, I'm here, Dallas. As this long night moves on over here, the presses of Fleet Street have begun to roll with tomorrow morning's papers, and the reactions, comments, and tributes are now pouring in and piling up, as you have heard over there. But before I go into that, there's a family note. Mrs. Kennedy's sister, Lee, the Princess Radziwill, who was deeply shocked by what happened. She heard about it by a phone call from America, is flying to the United States in the morning. And among the comments now, the Archbishop of Canterbury, who of course is Anglican, said tonight, "I am deeply grieved by the death of President Kennedy. He was a statesman of Christian ideals whose service to his fellows was inspired by his faith in God, and the world will be the poorer for his death and the better for his great example." Also, in addition to the solemn requiem mass that will be said here at the cathedral in London, the great bell of the Westminster Cathedral will be tolled every minute for 1 hour between 11 a.m. and 12 noon tomorrow. Now, the political world of Britain, of course, has had the deepest shock at the president's death, and both houses of Parliament, which were in adjournment when the news came, will be meeting again on Monday after a weekend recess, and that meeting will evidently turn into a heartfelt session of tribute to the president. The leaders of all three parties obviously want to give expression to their feelings about the president. And while waiting for the Prime Minister to give his message to the nation, the new British Foreign Secretary, Mr. R.A. Butler, sent a message to Secretary of State Dean Rusk, his opposite number in America, saying that he was deeply grieved by the tragic news which dominates our lives this evening. President Kennedy has been universally admired and respected in Britain as one of the outstanding political leaders of our century. We sorrow with you over the irreparable loss, for his death deprives us no less than you of an inspiring leader of the free nation. And there have been other comments from political leaders here. The leader of the Liberal Party, Joe Grimmon, said he was not only a great president of the United States, he was a great leader and fighter for many things in which we all believe, for freedom, for equality between races, for the values which all democracy upholds. Now, right across the Irish Channel from Britain is the country of Ireland, which the president visited, as you recall, during the summer. And Ireland has literally been stunned tonight by the news of the president's death. Television and cinema programs there were interrupted for the announcement of the news, and a great many people, it's understood, have been calling their relatives in America to find out more details, and some of the president's cousins in County Wexford is now trying to arrange to get to the funeral. President De Valera of Ireland, who was host to President Kennedy in June, also expressed his grief in a message of condolence to Mrs. Kennedy. He said that he was speaking for himself and for his nation. He said that the sympathy of Ireland went out to Mrs. Kennedy and that the heart of the nation was with her in her great grief. Prime Minister of Northern Ireland, who happened to be in London tonight, also sent a message of condolence to the President's brother, Robert Kennedy, the Attorney General. And just a small personal note again, London School of Economics was having a dance tonight, the Students' Union, and they stopped the dance on hearing of the death. President Kennedy was a student there for a short time back in 1939. Also, as the newspapers begin pouring out from the presses of Fleet Street, some of the editorials have now come to hand, and one of the most outspoken is from the Liverpool Daily Post. It quotes Disraeli, the famous Prime Minister of Britain in the 19th century, saying that assassination has never changed the course of history, declared Disraeli, with the sublime confidence of the Victorian high noon. Can we be so confident now? President Kennedy has been called the symbol of a new age, an age of young men and liberal ideas. But he was more than the symbol. He was the spearhead of that age's attack, and against him was ranged all the entrenched conservatism of his own country and the world. Who will carry on his fight after the damnable, wicked destruction of yesterday? There will be plenty to offer themselves, but hardly another of his caliber. Liverpool Daily Post. And so it goes. There will be comments from all the leading papers as the night goes on, and all of them sound the same note, the note of tragedy, of a terrible blow that has been struck not only in America, but for the entire world.
Well, I'm sure, Alex, that those sentiments expressed by the Liverpool Daily Post and all the other newspapers in England are fully shared by everyone in this country, and as you say, by everyone else around the world. We've already been getting a flood of reaction from behind the Iron Curtain. The Russians, according to Stu Novins, were absolutely stunned, almost beyond words, when they heard about it.
Well, there's a note of that kind here, too. Although it's rather late tonight, almost 11 o'clock here, the American Embassy is staying open tonight so that people can come in and write messages of regret and sympathy which at tables which have been specially set up. And businessmen and students and natives of the Commonwealth, Americans visiting Europe, and all sorts of people have just come in off the streets, packed the hall of the embassy, and are signing the book there and sending messages of regret to America.
That's a very touching note, Alex. Well, we'll be back to you later on. Thank you very much for that latest report on the reaction in England and elsewhere in the United Kingdom to the assassination of the president.
We interrupt briefly for a special bulletin from the WCCO Radio News Bureau regarding a cancellation of importance in our region. The Minnesota-Wisconsin football game tomorrow afternoon in Minneapolis has been called off because of the assassination of the president. University of Minnesota officials announced just moments ago that President O. Meredith Wilson, in consultation with the president of the University of Wisconsin, had made the decision. They said the game may be made up later. Repeating, the Minnesota-Wisconsin football game scheduled tomorrow in Minneapolis has been called off. Now we return to our CBS News coverage in New York.
Before we go back to CBS News, Dick, I'd like to pass along some meeting cancellations, meetings which have been called off because of the tragic event of this day. St. Michael's Ukrainian Orthodox Church at 4th Street Northeast and 5th Avenue. Special service tonight, 7 p.m. Canceled. A memorial service this evening at 7:30 p.m. at the Congregational Church in Anoka. May I repeat that first announcement? St. Michael's Ukrainian Orthodox Church, 4th Street Northeast and 5th Avenue, will have a special service tonight at 7 p.m. These are notices of special services. St. Peter's AME Church at 4th Avenue and 41st Street South will hold a special memorial service at 7:30 this evening. St. Peter's Lutheran Church in Edina, a memorial service at 7 p.m. this evening. Hope Lutheran Church at Nokomis Park will hold a prayer service at 8 o'clock this evening. And here are some cancellations. The Simley-Randolph basketball game at Randolph, Minnesota tonight is canceled, and the St. Vincent's Osseo PSA dance at Crystal Knights of Columbus Hall has been canceled, scheduled for tonight. Here are some more church services which will be held this evening. High Requiem Mass, St. Andrew's Church at Granite Falls, Minnesota at 7 this evening. Holy Communion, Episcopal Church of St. John the Evangelist, Portland and Kent and St. Paul at 7:30 this evening. A special service will be held at the Shalom Tabernacle at 2054 James Avenue North in Minneapolis at 8 o'clock this evening, and a memorial service at the Knox Presbyterian Church at 4747 Lindale Avenue South in Minneapolis will be held at 7:30 p.m. We repeat, the Minnesota-Wisconsin Big Ten football game scheduled for tomorrow at Memorial Stadium in the Twin Cities has been called off. The Wisconsin-Minnesota game called off. The Vikings-Lions game for Sunday will be played. The Vikings-Lions game for Sunday will be played. General Manager Larry Haig of Wcco-Radio announced that the entire regular scheduled programs on WCCO is being preempted for this special memorial broadcast. The broadcast will continue for the balance of the day. CCO temperature in the Twin Cities is 30 degrees. The wind from the northwest at 27 miles an hour, gusting to 32. Relative humidity is 72. Barometer 29.72 inches and rising rapidly. And the sky is cloudy. The time is 18 minutes before 5 o'clock. We return now to CBS Radio. The special memorial service and broadcasts of today's tragic event are now in progress.
This report is coming to you from a CBS reporter in Santa Monica, California.
Back at the CBS News headquarters in New York, we now have the taped excerpt of the statement of shock expressed by New York's Governor Nelson Rockefeller. Let's hear that from our tape room.
This is a shocking and terrible tragedy for the nation and the world. Mrs. Rockefeller and I join with all New Yorkers and every American in extending heartfelt sympathy to Mrs. Kennedy and the President's family. May God grant strength and guidance to Lyndon Johnson as he assumes his grave responsibilities under these tragic circumstances. The prayers of all of us will be with him. I have proclaimed for the state of New York a 30-day period of mourning, and I have directed that all state offices shall be closed on the day of the President's funeral.
New York's Governor Nelson Rockefeller, as he expressed shock at the assassination of President Kennedy. President Lyndon Johnson will make his first statement as the nation's new chief executive at Andrews Air Force Base when the presidential jet arrives from Dallas in just about a half an hour from now. And after that statement, President Johnson will fly to the White House aboard a helicopter where he will meet with Defense Secretary McNamara and McGeorge Bundy, who was special assistant to President Kennedy on national security affairs. Later this evening, the new president will confer with both Democratic and Republican leaders of the House and the Senate. At the time of the president's death, a red, white, and blue presidential plane was flying over the Pacific, heading for Tokyo, carrying Secretary of State Dean Rusk and 5 other Kennedy cabinet members to Tokyo for a meeting. The word was received of the president's death from our Pacific military commander, Admiral Harry Felt, who called the plane by radio telephone and gave the first word of President Kennedy's assassination. Secretary of State Rusk, upon hearing the news, said simply, "We are turning around." And the plane did turn around and has flown back to Honolulu, and soon the presidential party will be back on its way to Washington for the funeral.
Inevitably, Alan, people will be turning their minds back to the events of 1960, when Lyndon Johnson fought so hard and so vigorously for the Democratic presidential nomination, only to lose out in the end to the man whom he has now succeeded because of the assassination of John Kennedy. Mr. Kennedy's election in 1960 was by the closest popular vote margin of any election in this century. Republican leaders at the time said that Lyndon Johnson's effectiveness in holding the South played a large part in the defeat of the Republican ticket headed by Vice President Richard M. Nixon and Henry Cabot Lodge, who had resigned from his post at the United Nations in order to make the race. The electoral vote in November 1960 was 300 for Kennedy and Johnson, 223 for Nixon and Lodge, 269 were needed to elect. Mr. Johnson had been mentioned as a possible presidential candidate long before he actually became one in 1960. There was widespread speculation in 1954, in Washington and elsewhere, that he was, in fact, aiming at the White House. But Senator Johnson scoffed at the idea then, and he said, "Talk of my being a potential candidate is a lot of foolishness. I have no interest, no ambition in that direction. I am conscious of my limitations. I think it's fair to say that nobody but my mama ever thought I'd get as far as I did." But the talk persisted, and his presidential stock took a dramatic upsurge in 1956 when Texas voters gave him a landslide victory over Governor Allen Shivers in a battle for control of the Democratic Party in that state. That was 1 year after Mr. Johnson had suffered a fairly severe heart attack, which took him out of action for several weeks. But later on, he staged a complete recovery from that heart attack, and since then, there's been no sign of anything but good health on the part of the vice president. In any event, what happened in Texas was shortly before the Democratic National Convention was held in Los Angeles. Shivers had bolted the party, and he led Texas in a Democrats for Eisenhower sweep in 1952. Johnson was regarded as one of the top dark horse candidates for the Democratic nomination for president in 1956, but he was not an announced candidate. The convention chose Adlai Stevenson in 1956 as its standard bearer. It chose Senator Estes Kefauver, who himself died only 2 months ago, as the vice presidential candidate, and Kefauver beat Senator Kennedy for the vice presidential nomination in the last minutes of a hair-raising ballot in the Democratic Convention in 56. In 1957, Senator Johnson, then the majority leader of the Senate, piloted through the Senate the first civil rights bill in more than 80 years. 3 years later, he beat down a Southern filibuster in order to get another such measure passed. In between those two events, he promoted a change in Senate rules that made it easier to cut off debate. And during the past year, one of the principal objectives of President Kennedy was to pass another and even broader civil rights bill, a bill which has passed the Judiciary Committee of the House of Representatives, but so far has shown little sign of actually coming to the floor for passage. It'll be interesting to see what President Johnson does about that bill. There was a time during the civil rights debate 3 years ago when it looked as if Senator Johnson might lose a sizable chunk of the South's 352 presidential nominating ballots if he saw the nomination that year. Many colleagues in the Senate had criticized him for bringing the measure up, accusing him of turning against the South. But Johnson insisted the bill that he was engineering was a moderate, reasonable voting rights measure. The South was won over to his way of thinking, and soon it was strongly behind his candidacy. After he lost the Democratic presidential nomination, Senator Kennedy immediately asked him to take the vice presidential nomination, which he did.
Dallas, you know, I've been somewhat curious at the strange lack of any information on the suspect or suspects who have been picked up in connection with the assassination. We've been told that Fort Worth police are questioning one young man in connection with the assassination, and the Dallas police are holding another in connection with the shooting of a Dallas policeman near the same area this afternoon. But beyond that, very little has been announced as to what is happening.
It's a very peculiar circumstance. We did hear a while ago that the building where the fatal shots were fired had been surrounded by police, but there's been no actual announcement that anyone was arrested in that building.
That is right. There's also the amazingly accurate marksmanship of the assassin, who, if he did, as apparently he did, shoot from the 5th or 6th floor of this building, killed the president apparently with one bullet. He actually, the doctors say, apparently was hit twice, but it was the first bullet that made at least 2 wounds. And the doctors who treated him say that the president lost consciousness as soon as he was hit and never revived. And they said they never had any hope of saving his life. He was hit about 1:25 Eastern Time, and he died just 35 minutes later. This is amazing accuracy for an assassin.
Especially at a moving target.
Yes, indeed. And he fired 3 shots, so far as anybody has been able to tell, and he hit Governor Connolly twice and President Kennedy once or twice.
Well, obviously, he's a marksman and a sharpshooter, whoever he is. But it is amazing, as you say. Apparently, the first shot was directed at the president. That seems to have been the gist of what eyewitnesses have said, that when the first shot was fired, the president was hit, and then the second, probably the third shots were fired at the governor.
There was that strange series of wounds suffered by the governor from one of the bullets, as the doctors have reported, that the one bullet hit him in the chest, breaking at least 1 or more ribs, then tore a wound into his thigh, and finally ended up injuring his wrist, which was a highly volatile bullet to go that far before it finally stopped.
Obviously, it was a well-planned assassination. It wasn't any spur-of-the-moment affair. When you think back to the assassination attempt on President-elect Roosevelt in 1933, this man was simply waiting in the crowd, hoping to get a chance at Franklin Roosevelt. And when the president came along with Mayor Cermak of Chicago, he simply opened fire on him, and it was... Apparently, he wasn't in any position to wait carefully, as this man obviously did today in Dallas, Texas. And now we're going to switch again to Western Europe, and we'll hear once more from CBS News correspondent Daniel Shore in Bonn.
Chancellor Ludwig Erhard has just stepped off the train coming from Paris. He wouldn't say anything at the station. Grim-faced, he walked to his car and drove directly to the radio station, where he has recorded a short statement that will be on German radio in about 10 minutes from now. By the courtesy of West German Radio, we are able to provide you first with Chancellor Erhard's statement, and here it is.
Meine verehrten Hörerinnen und Hörer.
My honored hearers.
Wir alle haben John F. Kennedy verloren.
We have all lost President Kennedy.
Können in dieser Stunde nicht ausdrücken, was wir alle an Schmerz und Trauer empfinden.
Words cannot now express our pain and sadness.
Verneigen wir uns vor dem Toten.
We mourn for the
Ideale
dead.
der westlichen Welt, Freiheit und Menschenwürde,
who represented for the whole Western world humanity and human dignity.
war ein Freund und ein treuer Verbündeter des deutschen
He was a friend and a loyal ally.
Unerschrockenheit und Standhaftigkeit gerade in schweren Stunden viel verdankt.